one lesson. Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter. Welcome to Terraform Tuesday. Today's topic, we are going to be talking about Templatefile versus Templatefile. Wait, that seems like the same thing. No, it's not. It's template_file versus Templatefile, all one word. One's a function, and the other one is a data source, and they're different, and one is preferred over the other. And it's something I discovered as I was working on my presentation for HashiTalks, which is happening this week. So if you happen to watch this, and it's not yet Wednesday, which is the day after today, which is the 17th, then you can watch me do my Boundary on Azure talk live, which is where I discovered this Templatefile versus Templatefile thing. Or you can watch the the post-recording of it, because I am doing it live. I'm not pre-recording it. So you can watch that later if you don't tune in time for that. Also, I will be emceeing HashiTalks for the Thursday session, and that is going to be the 18th. So I will be doing the emceeing, which is just kind of like introducing the next speaker. I'll be doing that from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. So if you want to, say hi and jump in the YouTube chat, that is going to be live. So you can absolutely do that. That would be cool as well. So that's what's going on with me. A lot of stuff. Before we dive into the topic at hand, just a quick reminder, I do have a Patreon. The link is down in the description. If you're enjoying these videos, you want to keep them coming, please support. It's the bottom tier is only $2. $2. And for that, you also get a weekly newsletter of everything that's going on with me, the Day 2 Cloud podcast, the Buffer Overflow podcast, the Daily Check-In podcast, which I've brought back, and Terraform Tuesday, of course. So there's a lot of stuff in that newsletter, and maybe too much. I don't know. And I'm going to add more, because why not? Because I need to make life more complicated. But anyway, let's talk about Templatefile versus Templatefile. Data source versus function. Why would you use one over the other? Now, the main thing to understand about Terraform functions is that they're built into the binary. All of the functions that exist in Terraform are not being imported from some plugin or something. They are built into that binary. And so over time, more functions have been added as seem necessary. They've generally taken an approach of, if it's not absolutely essential to Terraform, it's not going to get included in the binary, because they don't want the binary to bloat out with all of these different functions. Every time they add one, they're going to have to add a bunch of code, right? Okay, that makes sense. Whereas data sources, those come from a provider plugin. Now, the provider plugin in question is the template provider plugin, which is maintained by HashiCorp. But this is important to remember, in order to use a provider, you have to download the plugin first, and then the plugin has to be loaded by Terraform and used. So there is a big difference between the two. First, let's start with template_file, the data source. Okay, template_file, the data source is part of the template provider. And essentially what it's used for is you want to express a very long string of some kind. And that's maybe a callback to why I was playing violin a moment ago. Strings. I'm also terrible, and obviously, because it's my son's violin, not mine. It's a viola at that. But anyway, so basically, you want to construct a very long string that you're going to use somehow. One of the more common ones is creating config files on the fly for VM that you're spinning up, or creating custom data or a cloud init that you're going to use for that virtual machine. That's a very common use case for templates, but there's obviously other reasons you would do it. So you want to create this long multi-line string, and you don't want that whole thing to reside inside your Terraform configuration file. Instead, you want to have a separate template file that has that information in it. And you just want to pass some values that you have in your Terraform config to that template file and have them interpreted, and then have the contents of that template file available for use. So that was the original idea behind the template file data source provider. But the downside to it is, because of the way the plugin was written, it only accepts string values for your variables. Okay, so that's the important thing to understand about Templatefile, is it's in a plugin, it's separate from Terraform, and it only takes strings. It cannot accept more complicated type object types. In fact, if we want to be completely technical here, the template file will accept any primitive from Terraform. So that could be a Boolean, a number, or a string. it will not accept anything more complicated than that. Any of the more complex objects like sets, lists, tuples, or maps or objects. It's not going to take any of those. So that's a major downside to using it. The Templatefile function, no underscore, just Templatefile, on the other hand, will accept any complex object. It also doesn't use a provider. It's just a built-in function. And it basically does the same thing. It renders text into a value that you can use. So that's probably enough talking. Why don't we actually take a look at the structure of Templatefile and figure out how to use it in the context of a configuration. Okay, this is the Templatefile format. And if we direct our eyes to the beginning, we have to say data keyword because this is a data source. And then the type is template_file. And then we have to give it a name by which we can refer to it later in the Terraform configuration. It takes two arguments. One is template. Template tells Terraform where to find the actual template. And we're going to use the file function to read in the contents of a file, but you can also define the template in line. And this was fairly common to do in older configurations. In fact, I did it a number of times for configuring the subnet masks for different VNets and stuff like that. So you could define it in line, or you can read it in from a file using the file function. And then the second argument is variables. The variables argument is where you specify what variable values you want to pass over to the Templatefile data source. So it's just a map of var name and then the var value you want to pass. And then you can refer to that value by the var name inside the template, whether the template is defined in line or in the file. So that's the basic idea. Why don't we go over to Visual Studio Code and I'll take you through an actual example of using Templatefile. All right, here we are in Visual Studio Code, and just a quick reminder, you can always find these files. They are on my GitHub account under the registry Terraform Tuesday. I've just popped up the link so now you can see that, and the link is also down in the description, so you can find it there as well. Today's date is 2021-02-16, so that is the directory we're going to be working with, and I've also added Templatefile on there, so let me give you a quick reminder of what's in that folder. I've got two directories in here, template_file, so that's an example using the data source type. And then I have another one called Templatefile. That's an example using the function. Let's start with the data source, expand that out. I've got a few files here. The first one is locals, and that is a listing of the values we're going to use to submit to our template. So we've got a string that's equal to taco. We've got a list of 3 ingredients or 3 different meats. We've got a my set. I'm using the function toSet to convert the list to a set. And just remember, set is an unordered tuple, so you can't refer to the elements by the index number because it's unordered. And then finally, we have my map, which is a simple key value pair of meat, cheese, and shell. Isn't that fun? Okay, so the next thing we'll do is take a look in the main.tf, and just like we saw in the presentation, I start with the data keyword, Templatefile, and then I'm calling this one test. And then the file that I'm going to use as my template, the value for the argument, I'm using the file function to read in the contents of test.tmpl. Now, I could do this in line, like I said. Also, the actual naming of the file doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be .tmpl or .tpl or anything like that. That just gives you a clearer idea of what that file's for if you happen to be looking through the directory. So don't worry too much about naming. All right, now we're going to give it a list of values, and we'll start with myString. So myString is the name of the variable, and we're passing it the value that's in local.myString. For the next one, we are going to pass it local.myList to store in myList. And this should fail. This should not validate properly because Templatefile data source, it doesn't like non-strings. It doesn't want to accept a list. So let's prove that by running Terraform validate. But before we do that, we first have to run Terraform init. And one thing that I want to point out after init runs successfully, there we go. If we scroll up, we can see that it downloaded and installed the HashiCorp template provider plugin. And there's now a .terraform directory off to the left. That's because it had to download the plugin. So that's one strike against using this style is you have to download a plugin, whereas with Templatefile, the function, you don't have to do any of that. Okay, now let's go ahead and try running Terraform validate. And it's going to come back with an error, and it's basically saying, hey, that thing you sent me, it is a tuple with 3 elements. That's no good. I need a string. That's what I want. Okay, so how are we going to fix that? Well, here's what we can do. We can comment out this one and uncomment this one and save it. And what I'm doing here is I'm using a function called join. Join takes a list and it combines all the elements of the list into one string with whatever separator you specify. So I'm specifying a comma as the separator, so I can join all these elements together and it'll spit out a string. Now, if I do Terraform validate again, it's going to see, oh, that's a string now. Configuration is valid. We're all good. I can do the same thing with a map, but I have to get a little more complicated with a map because a map is made up of keys and values. It's pairs. So I have to have one value for the keys, and I'll use join to join all the keys together, and I'll get the keys by using the keys function on my map. No, it sounds pretty complicated, right? And then I have to do the same thing for values. So now I have one string that's all my map keys separated by commas, and another string that's all my map values separated by commas. And then finally, I can try using the set that I created by also using the join function. So all of them are strings. And then for the output, we will output the rendered template. And you can find that by data.templatefile.test. So that's the path of that resource. And then .rendered is the attribute of the actual rendered template. Okay, what does the template look like? Last thing. All right, this is very straightforward. The first thing, we're going to print out our string. And the way that we do that is this interpolation method, $, curly brace, the name of the variable that you want to get the value of, and then a closed curly brace. So that's how we get the string. We can also iterate across a list or a map. But the thing is, how do you do that when you're not able to pass a list or a map? Well, I have to reassemble it. And the way that I do that is by using the split function in here and passing it the comma as the thing to split on, and then my list as the thing to split, and it will return a list of values. Now, the %sign curly braces is a way of telling Terraform that within this template, I want you to do something. In this case, we want to run a for loop. You could also do an if-then statement in here. So we start our for loop, and I want to say for each element in my list, I'm calling it I want to print out, here's a value, and then I, whatever that value is, and then % curly braces end for lets it know that's the end of the for loop. Then we can do the same thing for our map. We can reconstruct our map by using zip map, and then we're going to have to split the keys and split the values, and then zip the keys and the values together. So there's a lot of construction that has to go on here to make use of Templatefile if we want to use a more advanced object type. And then I'm doing another for loop. For k being the key and v being the value, I'll print out my key and is value v, whatever that is, and end my for loop. And then we can do the same thing for a set that we did for the list. So does this work? Does it render properly? Well, let's find out. Let's do a Terraform apply. And we're going to do auto approve so it doesn't bother me with that. And after a second, it should print out. There we go. So it's used the output to print out the rendered version of my template. If I scroll up here, see it starts with EOT. So this lets it know that this is a here.doc string. So it should be used as all one string, even though that there's new lines in here. And then it printed out taco, it printed out my list, it printed out my map, and it printed out my set. So that all worked. We're good. If we want to use template_file data source, we can do that. But let's take a look at Templatefile, the function, and use that instead. So I'm going to go back to the presentation for a second just to show you what Templatefile, the function, looks like. This is the Templatefile function. It's a little bit different than the template_file data source. You don't have to use the file function to read in the contents of a file because it's expecting you to give it the path to a file as the first argument. So no need to use the file function here. You just tell it, what's the path to my template? And then the next thing it's expecting is a map of variable name and variable value key pairs. So that's all you need to specify for a Templatefile. It's actually a little bit simpler, and it's meant to be used in line as opposed to creating a data source and then consuming that data source somewhere else in the configuration. Let's go back over to Visual Studio Code and see how we can use that to render the same exact information. Okay, we're back in Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and expand out the Templatefile function example. For the locals, the values are exactly the same. I copied the locals file from one directory to another. Let's take a look at the main and see how that's a little bit different. Here, I am not invoking a data source at all. I'm simply specifying a single output, and then I'm using the Templatefile function to render the output value. And in this case, I've got my test.tmpl as the first argument. That's the template file I want to use. And then I have a map of my variable names and the values for those variables. And you can see I'm not doing any conversion here. I'm just giving the actual objects, the string, list, map, and set directly to the template file, and Terraform is going to know how to render that appropriately for each object type. Let's take a look at the template file itself. All right, so here is our template file. The string rendering remains exactly the same. But if we look at the first one where we iterate across the list, I don't have to do anything to the list. All I have to do is say for I in my list, print out the value of the list. Same thing for map, same thing for set. So it is much, much simpler. All right, so let's go up one directory, go into the template file function directory, and let's go ahead and initialize this Terraform configuration. And the thing I want to point out here is if we scroll up a little bit, it didn't download any plugins because I'm not using any plugins. Okay, that's kind of nice. And also, if we look to the left, it didn't create a .terraform directory because, again, I'm not using any plugins. Now, obviously, in a regular Terraform configuration, you would be using other plugins, but for this example, it's kind of nice. It's very fast. I didn't have to download anything. Okay, let's go ahead and run our Terraform apply, and we'll add the auto approve, and boom, there we go. Did you see how fast that was? Did you see how quickly it rendered it out? So it rendered out the exact same template that we had before, but it did it much faster because it didn't have to load a plugin and refresh the values that are stored in that plugin and mess around with state or anything like that. It just hit the function rendered the template, and the output went to our screen. Boom, 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 super fast. Now, there is one other option here, which is to not use either of these at all. What do I mean? Well, with all the advancements in Terraform since .12, things like built-in for loops and other ways to render text and its support for HereDoc formatting, it's actually not necessary to use this at all. So I have this one last file that's also in my template file, and I'm going to remove the rename so it becomes part of the configuration. And what I want to show you here is instead of having the template file in a separate file and rendering it that way, instead, I can actually just basically copy the contents of the template file directly over and then use this HereDoc syntax. So it's that two less than signs and then a keyword. I'm using end of text as the keyword. And then you have to have the same keyword at the bottom to complete the HereDoc text. And then you have the exact template right in here. And instead of passing variables, you can just refer directly to the values like local.mystring and local.mylist and render something out. So you have this option available to you as well. And now if we run Terraform apply again, now it's going to render out both of them. And I know it's a little bit hard to see that we're doing that, but it prints out twice here, once for the template and once for the inline version. So it prints out both. There's the inline version right there. So you can see if you don't want to use a template file, you don't have to. You can do the whole thing inline. So I guess, why would you choose to use template_file? I'm going to say you're not going to. If you have any existing Terraform configurations that are using the template file data source, it's time to convert over. I think HashiCorp has kind of been signaling that they're going to deprecate this thing anyway. They just haven't done it yet. So moving over to the newer template file function will get you away from something that's going to be deprecated anyway. It also means that's one less provider plugin you have to download. And also, you saw how quickly it rendered. Imagine having that speed up for much more lengthy template files that you might have in your configurations today. So definitely consider switching over to the template file function, but also consider whether or not you even need the template file. For me, the template file is more about readability than anything else. I want my Terraform configuration to be somewhat concise and readable. And if I have a really long and lengthy configuration in there, it's not very readable. So in the case of the boundary on Azure thing I did, I'm passing in a custom data value to the Azure VM for what it should do to bootstrap itself. And that thing is a couple hundred lines long. I don't want that in my Terraform config. I want that separate, and I want that rendered as a template. That makes sense to me. But if it's just a few lines, might as well do it in line with just regular text manipulation as opposed to pushing it over to a template file. So that's what I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you have suggestions for future shows, I want to hear them. I am curious about what is vexing you in the world of Terraform, and I would like to elucidate that thing for you. If you don't mind, if you have an extra $2 or $3 and you want to support these kind of videos, just a quick reminder, I am on Patreon. The link is down in the description. If that's not your bag, and I totally understand, you know, times are tough, you can always support me by subscribing to the channel and letting a friend know. Just let them know what's going on. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much again for watching. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe out there, and go get yourself a taco. What are you still doing here? The video's over. Go home. Go. Go. Go home.